An elderly woman was screaming and begging, "I can't take it anymore." The situation escalated until the millionaire finally arrived home. Upon entering, he took one look at the scene and immediately began to shout, "What you're about to hear today might change the way you see things. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ending." The sharp, crystalline shatter of the glass seemed to freeze the very air in the sunlit Kentucky kitchen. Margaret stood motionless, her 76-year-old hand still hovering where the tumbler had been, a single drop of blood welling from her thumb. It was just a cheap glass, but the sound it made hitting the terracotta tiles was one of pure, expensive finality. "Porcelain Jesus, Margaret. Not the good set." Vanessa's voice was a whip crack, slicing through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She stormed into the room, her designer heels clicking a furious staccato against the floor. She didn't look at the blood, now tracing a thin red line down Margaret's wrist. She looked at the shards, her face a mask of pristine irritation. "Are your hands just useless now, is that it? You can't even hold a simple glass of water?" Tears, hot and shameful, sprang to Margaret's eyes. She tried to stammer an apology, to explain how her arthritic fingers had simply betrayed her, but the words dissolved into a choked sob. Vanessa's grip was firm and unyielding, not on her wounded hand, but on her upper arm. "Stop that blubbering. It's pathetic. You need to learn to be more careful in my house." She steered Margaret away from the sparkling mess on the floor, not toward the sink and the bandages, but toward the bare, eggshell white wall of the breakfast nook. "For God's sake, just sit here and calm down. Look at the wall. Maybe it will help you remember not to be so clumsy next time." Vanessa's voice was low, venomous, meant for Margaret's ears alone. The old woman sank into the wooden chair, her shoulders shaking with silent, humiliated tears. She stared at the blank wall, a canvas for her misery, the coppery taste of blood from where she'd bitten her lip mixing with the salt of her tears. The cut on her thumb throbbed in time with her racing heart. Minutes stretched like hours in the suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Vanessa efficiently sweeping up the evidence of her transgression. No one came. No one called out. She was utterly alone in her son's beautiful empty mansion. The sudden, distinct sound of the garage door grinding open was as shocking as the breaking glass had been. It was too early. David was never home this early. Margaret's breath hitched, a tiny, hopeful sound. She heard Vanessa's quick, frantic footsteps, the false, bright tone as she called out, "David? Honey, is that you? Everything's fine." But David was already in the doorway of the kitchen, his successful lawyer's gaze missing nothing. He took in the scene in a single, horrifying instant. His mother, crumpled and crying, facing a wall like a disobedient child, the pristine kitchen, and his wife's frozen, guilty smile. His briefcase hit the floor with a heavy thud. His face, usually a mask of calm authority, drained of all color, then hardened into something cold and terrifying. "Vanessa." His voice was dangerously quiet, a controlled tremor running through it. "What in God's name is going on? Mother, your hand." He was across the room in 3 long strides, kneeling before her, his own hands, so much larger and stronger than hers, gently reaching for her injured one. He looked from her tear-streaked face to his wife's, and the silent question hanging in the air was far more frightening than any shout. A question about a promise he had made a long time ago in a very different kitchen. The silence that followed David's question was heavier and more brittle than the shattered glass on the floor. It was Vanessa who broke it, her voice a strained, high-pitched melody of forced normalcy. "It's nothing, David. Really. Margaret had a little accident with a glass. She got a bit upset, and I just had her sit down to collect herself before she hurt herself further. You know how she gets?" David didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on his mother's hand, the single drop of blood now a smeared, rusty line against her papery skin. He saw the way she flinched at the sound of Vanessa's voice, a subtle, terrified tremor that told him more than any words ever could. This was not a little accident. This was a ritual of humiliation. "Look at me, Mother," he said, his voice soft but firm. When her watery, ashamed eyes met his, he asked again, "What happened?" Margaret's lips trembled, her gaze darting toward Vanessa and then back to the safety of her son's face. The words were a broken whisper. I dropped it. My hand. It just gave way. I'm so sorry, David. I didn't mean to. She was facing the wall, David stated, the words flat and cold. He finally turned his head, his gaze lifting to pin his wife where she stood. Why was my mother facing the wall, Vanessa? Vanessa's mask of placid concern slipped, revealing the raw irritation beneath. She needed to calm down. She was working herself into a state. I was just trying to help her regain her composure. By making her sit in a corner? David's voice began to rise, the controls starting to fray. Like a child? Like a dog? He stood up slowly, his height suddenly seeming to dominate the sunlit kitchen. He took a step toward her, and for the first time, Vanessa took a half step back. I heard you. From the garage door I heard you. Stop that blubbering. It's pathetic. Those were your words. To my mother. The confrontation was now bare and ugly in the sterile air. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, her fear morphing into a defensive, venomous rage. Oh, so now I'm the villain? After everything I've put up with? Having her here, disrupting our lives, her constant helplessness, the messes. This is my house, David, and I will not have it treated like a nursing home for a clumsy old woman. Your house? David's laugh was a short, harsh bark. My money bought every tile on this floor, Vanessa. My work pays for your designer heels that you click across it while you torment a defenseless woman. I brought my mother here to live out her years in comfort and dignity, in the safety of her family's home. And you? You have never, not for one single day, treated her with a shred of that dignity. Dignity? Vanessa spat the word back at him. You want dignity? Then she should act with some. She's a burden, David, a fragile, weeping burden you dumped in my lap and expected me to handle with a smile. You're never here. You're always at the office, living your important life, while I'm stuck here playing nursemaid to a woman who can't even hold a glass of water. The cruelty of the words hung in the air, a poison that seemed to suck the very light from the room. Margaret let out a small, wounded sound, curling in on herself in the chair. David stared at his wife, and in that moment he didn't see the beautiful woman he'd married. He saw a stranger, cold and cruel. Get out, he said, his voice dropping back to that terrifying quiet. Vanessa blinked, her rage faltering. What? Get out of this kitchen. Get out of my sight. Go upstairs, now. The command was absolute, the voice of a lawyer who was used to being obeyed without question. For a long moment, she stood her ground, her chest heaving with indignant fury. But seeing the unyielding granite in his eyes, the complete absence of the man she could manipulate, she finally turned on her heel. Her exit was silent, but the air she left behind was thick with her resentment. David waited until her footsteps faded upstairs before he turned back to his mother, the anger drained from his face, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. He knelt before her again, his large hands enveloping her small, wounded ones. I am so sorry, Mother, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I am so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have known. He gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. This ends now. Today. I made a promise to Dad and to you that you would be safe and loved. I failed you, but I swear to you on my life, it will never happen again. You are safe with me. Margaret's sobs finally broke free, no longer of shame, but of a painful, overwhelming relief. She leaned her forehead against his, her frail body trembling as he held her. The storm had passed, but David knew the wreckage remained. He had protected her from one battle, but as he looked toward the staircase, he knew the war for his family's soul was just beginning, and the terms of their fragile peace had just been irrevocably shattered. The war for the family's soul was brief, brutal, and decided before the sun had fully set on that terrible day. David did not sleep in the master bedroom that night. He stayed in the guest room adjacent to his mother's, the door ajar, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing, a sound he now understood was a testament to her survival. The image of her, small and broken before that blank wall, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. It was an image that erased a decade of marriage in a single, clarifying instant. The next morning, the air in the mansion was arctic. David, dressed in a suit as dark as his mood, found Vanessa already in the kitchen, sipping coffee as if nothing had happened. The performance of normalcy was more offensive than any outburst. We need to talk, he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He didn't sit. Vanessa took a slow, deliberate sip. If this is about yesterday, David, I think you're overreacting. I was stressed. She was hysterical. It was a moment, that's all. It was the final moment, Vanessa, he stated, his lawyer's precision cutting through her feigned nonchalance. I am filing for divorce. Today. The porcelain cup met its saucer with a sharp clink. Her composure cracked, but not with sadness, with sheer incandescent fury. You're divorcing me? Over that? Over a clumsy old woman and a broken glass? I'm divorcing you for cruelty, he corrected, his gaze steady and cold. For systematic emotional abuse of a vulnerable elderly woman under my protection. I brought her into this house, and I failed to see the viper I'd placed beside her. That ends now. Vanessa stood up, her chair scraping violently against the tile. A viper? Look at you, the perfect son, forever tied to his mother's apron strings. You're not divorcing me for cruelty, David. You're divorcing me because you're incapable of putting a wife before your mother. You always have been. This promise you made, it's not duty, it's pathology. You are a boy playing at being a man, hiding behind a briefcase in a big house. But you've never left that little Kentucky kitchen where you grew up. Her words were meant to wound, to reframe his decency as a defect. But they bounced off the armor of his resolve. He saw the tactic for what it was, a desperate attempt to shift the blame. This has nothing to do with being a son and everything to do with being a decent human being. Something you have proven yourself incapable of. My attorney will have the papers drawn up by noon. I suggest you contact yours. The efficiency with which he moved was terrifying. By 11:30, a courier delivered a thick envelope. David had called in every favor, used every bit of his legal clout to expedite the uncontested filing. He had offered a settlement that was more than generous, a lump sum that would silence any claim of financial hardship, on the condition she signed immediately and walked away. He wasn't buying her silence. He was purchasing his mother's freedom. In his study, a room of dark wood and leather that had always been his sanctuary, they faced each other across the vast mahogany desk. Vanessa's pen hovered over the signature line. Her face was a pale, beautiful mask of contempt. You think this is a victory, don't you? She said, her voice a low hiss. Getting rid of the wicked witch so you and Mommy can live happily ever after in your sterile castle. David said nothing. He merely watched her, his expression impassive. You're a fool, David. You've chosen a past that's dying over a future we could have had. You'll be alone in this big, empty house with a fading memory, and one day you'll realize the cost of your precious loyalty. With a flourish that was both elegant and vicious, she signed her name. She stood, not looking at him again, and walked out of the study. David followed at a distance, watching as she wheeled a single suitcase to the waiting town car he had paid for. She didn't look back at the house, at him, or at the window of Margaret's room where a curtain twitched slightly. She simply slid into the back seat, and as the car began to pull away, she turned her head and looked directly at David standing in the doorway. It wasn't a look of sadness or regret. It was a challenging, defiant smile, a silent promise that this was not over. Then the car turned onto the main road and disappeared. The silence that settled over the property was profound. It was the silence of a storm's aftermath, the air cleansed, but the landscape scarred. David stood there for a long time, the signed divorce papers feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He had won. He had protected his mother. He had excised the poison from their lives. So why did the echo of Vanessa's final, smiling threat feel like a shard of that broken glass, still buried deep, waiting for the slightest movement to cause fresh, unexpected pain? The battle was won, but the victory felt hollow. And the future she had taunted him with, a future of isolation and regret, loomed like a ghost in the quiet halls of the house he had built, for a family that no longer existed. The hollow victory of Vanessa's departure left a silence that was both a relief and a weight. For days, David and Margaret moved through the cavernous house like ghosts, their interactions tender but strained by unspoken trauma. David worked from home, his attention perpetually divided between legal briefs and the quiet sound of his mother's movements in the next room. He saw the way she still flinched at a slamming car door, the way she apologized for the smallest of things, a dropped napkin, a spoon clinking too loudly against a bowl. The cut on her thumb had healed into a thin pink line, but the deeper wounds remained raw and unseen. The revelations came on a Thursday, born on the gentle breeze and the kind, observant eyes of Dorothy from next door. Dorothy was a widow of 10 years, her hair a soft cloud of white, her smile as warm and steady as the Kentucky sun. She arrived with a still warm peach cobbler, a classic Southern peace offering, and a gaze that missed very little. "I just thought y'all could use a little something sweet," she said, her voice a soft drawl as David let her in. Her eyes immediately found Margaret, who was sitting stiffly in the living room armchair, a book unopened in her lap. "Margaret, honey, you look like you could use a slice of this, and some good company." David busied himself in the kitchen, getting plates and coffee, his body in the room, but his ears tuned to the soft conversation in the living room. He heard Dorothy's gentle probing. "It's been awfully quiet over here since the other day. We heard the car leave. Everything all right?" There was a long pause. He could imagine his mother's nervous hands plucking at the fabric of her dress. Then her voice so small it barely carried. I caused such a fuss, Dorothy. I broke a glass." "Oh, honey," Dorothy murmured, her voice laced with a compassion that felt like a balm. "A glass is just a glass. They make new ones every day. It's the people in this world that are irreplaceable." The dam broke then, not with a torrent of words, but with a choked, tearful whisper from Margaret. She said I was a burden, a clumsy, weeping burden. She made me sit and look at the wall, like a child. I was so ashamed. David froze, the coffee pot hovering over a mug. He had known, of course he had known, but hearing the words from his mother's lips, hearing the raw shame in them, was a fresh knife to his heart. He heard Dorothy's chair scrape softly as she moved closer. "Margaret, you listen to me, and you listen good," she said, her voice firm yet incredibly gentle. "You are not a burden. You are a mother, a grandmother, a woman who has lived a long life and deserves respect and kindness in her own home. What that woman did to you was a sin, plain and simple. It was not your fault, not one bit of it. Your hands have worked for 76 years. They've earned the right to be a little tired. You deserve to be loved and cared for, not punished and shamed." A soft, shuddering sob came from the living room, followed by the rustle of an embrace. It was a different sound from the tears of humiliation he'd heard days before. This was the sound of release, of a heavy, poisonous truth being drawn out and neutralized by the sheer, unassailable force of another woman's kindness. David walked in then, setting the tray down. His eyes met Dorothy's over his mother's trembling shoulders. Margaret looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. But for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, not just relief, but a dawning sense of her own restored dignity. "Thank you, Dorothy," David said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Gratitude, guilt, profound relief. "Thank you for saying what she needed to hear." Dorothy gave a small, knowing nod. "Sometimes it takes a voice from outside the storm to speak the truth." She patted Margaret's hand. "You're going to be just fine, honey. You've got a good boy here." After Dorothy left, the house felt lighter. Margaret even managed a small, genuine smile as she ate her cobbler. David felt a knot of anxiety loosen in his chest. The truth was out, and it had been met with love, not judgment. His mother was on the path to healing. Yet, as he cleared the plates, the memory of Vanessa's defiant smile from the back of the town car flashed in his mind. Dorothy's kindness had salved one wound, but it hadn't erased the threat. He felt a cold prickle of apprehension down his spine. Vanessa was not a woman to accept defeat quietly. She had signed the papers, but her final, challenging look had been a promise. She was out there, her silence more menacing than any scream, and David knew, with a chilling certainty, that her retreat was only temporary. The battle for peace in his home was over, but the war with the ghost of his former life was yet to come. The ghost of Vanessa's threat did not linger in the air. It took root, festering in the shadows of a rented loft across town, paid for with the last of David's generous settlement. The money was an insult, a pittance compared to what she felt was her due, and the signed divorce papers were not a conclusion, but a declaration of war. David had chosen his senile mother over her, and for that, he would pay not just with his money, but with his peace. "He thinks he's won," Vanessa hissed, pacing the bare floorboards of the sparse apartment. The only furniture was a cheap table upon which a laptop glowed, displaying a live feed from a long-lens camera pointed at David's mansion. He's playing the devoted son, holed up in that fortress. But he can't stay there forever. He has a firm to run. He'll have to leave eventually. From a worn armchair in the corner, a man named Thomas watched her, his stillness a stark contrast to her frantic energy. He was in his late 40s, with the thick, corded forearms of a man who had worked with his hands all his life and a face that was a roadmap of hard living and poor decisions. His eyes, a flat gunmetal gray, held no emotion. He was an executor, a man who solved problems with blunt force. So we wait for him to leave, we go in, we take the old lady. Simple. It's not that simple, Thomas, a third voice cut in, smooth and analytical. Rebecca sat at the table, her fingers flying across a second keyboard. She was younger, sharp-featured, with eyes that missed nothing. A former paralegal David had fired for creative accounting. She held a grudge as cold and calculated as her mind. She was the strategist. The house has a top-tier security system. Motion sensors, cameras at every entrance, a direct line to a private security firm. Brute force won't get us past that. We need finesse. Vanessa stopped her pacing, a slow, cruel smile spreading across her lips. Finesse. And inside knowledge. David is paranoid about his mother's safety, but he's also a creature of habit, and he's sentimental. She leaned over Rebecca's shoulder, pointing a manicured finger at the screen, which now showed a schematic of the property. He won't take her with him on a business trip. He'll leave her there thinking she's safe, but he has a weakness. The coffer, Thomas grunted. The what? Not a coffer, a coffer, Rebecca corrected, her voice dripping with contempt for his ignorance. It's a small, fireproof safe in his study wall, behind that hideous landscape painting. He thinks no one knows about it, but I processed the paperwork for it. He keeps high-value items inside. Bearer bonds, a spare set of negotiable securities, a pouch of unset diamonds from his grandmother's estate, liquid, untraceable assets, enough to set all three of us up for a very long time. And he'll never give us the combination, Thomas stated flatly. He will, Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. For her. We don't need to crack the safe. We just need to crack him. We take Margaret. We make a video of her, looking frail and terrified. We send it to David. We tell him he has 1 hour to open the coffer, empty the contents into a bag, and leave it at a drop point. If he calls the police, if he hesitates, if he does anything other than exactly what we say, he gets his mother back in pieces. The plan crystallized in the stale air of the loft, a thing of beautiful, malicious elegance. Rebecca would handle the digital side, jamming the security signal for a precise 90-second window, creating a ghost in the machine. Thomas would be the muscle, the one to physically extract Margaret from the house. And Vanessa would be the architect, the voice on the phone, the puppeteer who would make David dance. We hit when David is at his most vulnerable, physically absent and emotionally compromised, Rebecca detailed, pulling up David's calendar, which she still had access to. He has a mandatory in-person partners meeting in Louisville next Thursday. It's a 4-hour round trip. He'll be gone for at least 6 hours. That's our window. Meanwhile, in the sunlit quiet of the mansion, a different kind of resolve was hardening. David stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, watching the evening light dapple through the oak trees in the yard. He could feel the threat, a low, persistent hum on the edge of his consciousness, a predator circling just beyond the fence line. He found his mother in the garden, carefully tending to a rose bush with Dorothy, her movements still hesitant, but no longer fearful. The sight filled him with a fierce, protective love. "Mother," he said, joining them, "I need to talk to you about something." Margaret looked up, her eyes clear. "What is it, dear?" "There's a partners meeting in Louisville next Thursday. It's important." He took her soil-stained hands in his. "But I'm not going. I've told them I'll attend via video conference." Surprise, then concern, flickered across her face. "David, no. You can't rearrange your entire life for me. I'll be fine. Dorothy will be here." "It's not just about company, Mother," he said, his voice low and serious. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to frighten her, but needing her to understand. "I made you a promise in this kitchen, that you would be safe, and I intend to keep it with every fiber of my being. I don't know what form the danger might take, or even if it will come at all. But I feel it. I will not leave you unprotected. Not for a day, not for an hour. My place is here with you." He saw the protest die on her lips, replaced by a profound gratitude. She squeezed his hands, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken threat they both felt, hanging in the air. David had drawn a line in the sand, fortifying his position, determined to wait out the storm he knew was coming. But in the dark loft across town, the storm was not just coming. It had a name, a face, and a clock that was already ticking down to next Thursday. Vanessa watched the live feed on her laptop, a predator studying its prey. David thought his vigilance was a shield. He didn't yet realize it was also a beacon, illuminating exactly what she needed to take from him. The silence in the mansion was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet of a garrison awaiting a siege. David's decision to stay home was a declaration, but it did little to calm the undercurrent of dread. The threat was no longer an abstract feeling. It had a name, and her name was Vanessa. It was Dorothy who made the call. "David," she'd said over sweet tea on her porch, her kind eyes sharp with concern, "you're a lawyer, not a bodyguard. What you need is a professional." 2 days later, Detective Sarah Evans from the Lexington Police Department's Adult Protective Services Unit was sitting in his study, a notebook open on her knee. She was a woman in her 40s, with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor and eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice even, "elder abuse, especially the emotional and psychological kind, is notoriously difficult to prove. It often comes down to one person's word against another's, but a pattern of behavior, combined with credible witness testimony, can build a case." David laid it all out, the broken glass, the wall, the verbal abuse he'd witnessed, the financial coercion in the divorce. He spoke of the lingering fear in his mother's eyes, the way she jumped at sudden noises. Sarah listened, her expression neutral but her gaze intent. "The divorce complicates things," she noted. "Her attorney will argue it's a retaliatory fabrication. We need something more." She turned to Margaret, who sat wringing her hands in a wingback chair. "Margaret, can you tell me about other times? Before the glass, times you felt small or afraid of Vanessa?" Margaret's voice was a fragile thread. She spoke of lost heirlooms, of being forgotten at a doctor's appointment, of Vanessa reading her mail aloud with a mocking tone. "She said my hands were like dead birds," Margaret whispered, staring at her lap. "Useless." Dorothy, who had insisted on staying for moral support, leaned forward. "I can testify to the change in her," she said firmly. "When Margaret first moved in, she had a light about her. She'd work in her garden for hours. These past few months, that light was gone. She looked haunted, and I heard the way Vanessa spoke to her over the fence once. Not the words, but the tone. It was pure ice." Sarah jotted it down. "This is good. This establishes a pattern and a credible witness. But without physical evidence or a direct recorded threat from Vanessa, it's a restraining order at best. It tells her to stay away, but it can't predict what she'll do." Later that night, the investigation took a more disturbing, intangible turn. A blood-curdling scream tore through the silent house. David was out of his bed and in his mother's room in seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs. Margaret was sitting bolt upright, her face pale and slick with sweat, her eyes wide with a terror that was not of the waking world. "The wall!" she sobbed, clutching at his arms, her grip surprisingly strong. "She's putting me back by the wall." "But it's not the kitchen wall, David, it's cold. And there's a sound, a grinding sound like a garage door, but it never stops." David held her, rocking her gently as she trembled. "It was a dream, Mother. Just a dream. You're safe. I'm here." But the nightmare repeated itself over the next 2 nights, each time more vivid. She began speaking of gray eyes watching from the trees, and the feeling of being weighed and measured. David shared this with Detective Evans during a follow-up call. "The gray eyes are new," Sarah said, her tone thoughtful. "Nightmares are one thing. They're a common trauma response, but the introduction of specific recurring details, it can sometimes be the subconscious trying to process a real observed threat. Has anyone new been in the neighborhood? Any unfamiliar cars?" David looked out his study window into the deepening twilight. The sprawling lawn, the tall oaks, they now felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a screen concealing a multitude of sins. He saw nothing but shadows, yet his mother's subconscious, honed by a lifetime of intuition, was screaming a warning that his own eyes could not yet see. The investigation had moved from building a legal case to deciphering a psychic distress signal, and David knew, with a cold certainty, that the storm was not just approaching. It was already here, whispering to his mother in her sleep. The morning sun, usually a comfort, felt like an interrogator's lamp. David had just brought his mother a cup of tea, a small ritual of normalcy they both clung to when he saw it. On the lace doily of her bedside table, centered with an almost ceremonial precision, lay a single folded square of plain white paper. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. "Mother, where did this come from?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm. Margaret looked up from her knitting, her brow furrowed. "I don't know, dear. I was just in the bathroom. Perhaps Dorothy left a note?" But Dorothy wouldn't have come and gone without a greeting. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, began to crystallize in David's stomach. He crossed the room, his fingers hovering over the paper. He noticed then what his mother had not. The window beside her reading chair was open a bare 2 inches at the bottom, just enough for a determined slip of paper to be pushed through from the outside. The screen was unlatched. He picked up the note. It was heavy, expensive stock, the kind Vanessa used for her correspondence. Unfolding it, he saw the message was not handwritten, but composed of letters cut from a magazine, a chaotic collage of different fonts and sizes that screamed of calculated menace. It read, "Your son can't watch you forever. Accidents happen to clumsy old women. You should have stayed gone." The world tilted. The air rushed from David's lungs as if he'd been struck. The words were a direct, venomous echo of Vanessa's kitchen tirade. This wasn't just a threat. It was a signature. It was her way of letting them know she was close, that she could reach into their sanctuary whenever she wished. "David, what is it?" Margaret's voice was thin with alarm. He couldn't speak. He simply turned the note toward her. Her hand flew to her mouth, a small, strangled gasp escaping her lips. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking ancient and terribly fragile. The fragile peace they had built over the past weeks shattered into a million glittering shards of fear. "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice a harsh whisper. He pulled her up, his grip firm, and guided her to the center of the room, away from any line of sight. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. She was here. She was right outside. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he misdialed twice. Sarah, it's David Henderson. She's here. She left a note, in my mother's bedroom." He choked out the words, reading the cut-out message aloud. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. "I'm on my way. Don't touch anything else. Don't let anyone in. I'm bringing my partner." The wait was an agony. David stood guard at his mother's bedroom door, his body rigid with a volatile mix of terror and a cold, burgeoning rage. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, her earlier strength seeming to evaporate under the directness of the threat. She stared at her hands, the hands Vanessa had called useless, as if they were already the instruments of the accident promised in the note. Detective Sarah Evans arrived within 15 minutes, her face set in grim lines. With her was her partner, Detective Miller, a broad-shouldered man with a quiet, observant demeanor. They moved with a professional efficiency that was both reassuring and terrifying. While Miller began a slow, methodical circuit of the property's exterior, Sarah entered the bedroom, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. She bagged the note without a word, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the open window, the unlatched screen, the view of the dense shrubbery just outside. "This was personal," Sarah stated flatly. "She wanted to hit where your mother feels safest. It's psychological warfare. The magazine letters are a cliché, but it means we won't get prints." "She's not an idiot," Miller returned, dusting his hands. "No clear footprints in the flower bed. Ground is too dry. But someone was definitely there. The mulch under this window is disturbed in a way that doesn't match the rest of the bed. They stood here, waited for their moment, and slipped it through." David ran a hand through his hair, a wave of helplessness threatening to drown him. "So what do we do? A restraining order is a piece of paper. This proves she'll violate it. She was in my yard." "It proves intent to harass and threaten, which is a step up." Sarah said, her gaze still fixed on the window. But you're right. It doesn't stop a bullet or a kidnapping. She turned to him, her expression deadly serious. Mr. Henderson, we need to escalate this. We have the pattern of abuse, a credible witness in Dorothy, and now a direct, tangible threat. This moves it from a potential civil matter to a clear and present criminal danger. I'm going to recommend a patrol car do regular drive-bys. But you need more. What more is there? David asked, his voice ragged. Miller spoke up, his voice a low rumble. We need to find her. We know she's local, she's fixated, and she's escalating. The partners meeting you skipped. She knew about it. She's watching your routines. That takes planning, resources. She's not working alone. The truth of it settled over David like a shroud. Vanessa with her rage, someone with technical know-how like Rebecca, and someone with the brute force to make an accident happen. A trinity of malice. Sarah's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, her face hardening. That's the preliminary from the lab. They lifted a partial from the windowsill. Smudged, but it's there. It's not enough for a positive ID on its own, but if we get a suspect, it's one more piece. She looked from David to his mother, her professional mask softening for a fraction of a second. We're building a case. It's slow, but we're building it. In the meantime, you are not safe here. This house, with all its windows and its sprawling property, is a liability. She's proven she can get close. The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy and urgent. What will you do now? The fortress had been breached. The rules of the siege had changed. David looked at his mother's terrified face, then back at the detectives, the weight of a terrible, necessary decision pressing down on him. He had to get her out. But where could they go that Vanessa wouldn't eventually find them? The silence in the wake of the detective's departure was heavier than before, freighted with a new, specific terror. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fishbowl, and the cat had just tapped on the glass. David paced the length of his study, the image of that cut-out note seared into his mind. Accidents happen. He could almost hear Vanessa's voice whispering the words, a serpent's hiss in the quiet room. Detective Sarah Evans had returned an hour later, not with a patrol car, but with a plan. Her partner, Mike Miller, was with her, his large frame seeming to make the room smaller, more secure. A restraining order is a shield made of paper against a bullet, Sarah stated, her hands flat on David's desk. We need to stop reacting and start controlling the narrative. We're going to set a trap. David stopped pacing. A trap? Using my mother as bait? Absolutely not. Not as bait, Mr. Henderson, Mike interjected, his voice a calm, low baritone. As the protected center of a defensive web. Vanessa has shown her hand. She's confident, she's close, and she's watching. We use that against her. We make her think she sees a vulnerability, and when she moves to exploit it, we're waiting. The plan was one of deliberate, psychological misdirection. Sarah laid it out with the precision of a military tactician. First, we create a false blind spot. Your mother's bedroom is on the southeast corner. The landscaping there is dense. We'll adjust the motion-activated floodlights on that side of the house. Not to turn them off, that's too obvious, but to slightly misalign the sensors, creating a narrow, shadowed path from the tree line to her window. It will look like a fault in the system, a lucky break for her. Second, Mike continued, we move your mother. Tonight, we take her to the guest room on the northwest side, the one with the best sight lines and no accessible ground floor access. We make it look like she's still in her old room. We leave a lamp on a timer. We might even put a vague seated silhouette in the chair at certain hours. The illusion must be maintained. David listened, his initial resistance crumbling under the cold logic of their strategy. This was proactive. This was fighting back. Third, we fortify the real perimeter, Sarah said. We install silent alarms on every first-floor window and door. The moment one is breached, our phones in the station get an alert, but no siren sounds. We don't want to scare them off. We want to catch them in the act. We also install 2 hidden, high-definition cameras with night vision. One will be trained on that false blind spot, the other covering the main hallway leading to your mother's decoy room. Finally, Sarah turned to Margaret, who had been listening quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret, this is the most important part. You are the last line of defense. We're going to give you a code word, a safe word. If anyone, and I mean anyone, including David or me or a uniformed officer you think you recognize, tries to get you to leave this room with them, you ask for the code word. If they don't know it, you scream. You fight. You set off the personal panic button we'll give you. You do not go with them. Do you understand? Margaret met Sarah's gaze, and for the first time since the note, a flicker of her old steel returned. The fear was still there, but it was being forged into resolve. She nodded firmly. I understand. The word is bluebird, Mike said gently. Can you remember that? Bluebird. Bluebird, Margaret repeated, the word a quiet, solid promise. They worked through the evening. A discreet technician from the security firm Sarah trusted arrived and performed the delicate surgery on the lighting system. David and Mike moved Margaret's essential belongings to the northwest guest room, making sure the transfer was invisible from the outside. The small, silent contact alarms were placed with painstaking care, and the tiny, dark-lensed eyes of the cameras were hidden in a smoke detector and a decorative wall sconce. Watching the monitors being set up in his study, David felt a strange sense of empowerment. The fear was still a cold stone in his gut, but it was now joined by a sharp, focused anticipation. He was no longer just a potential victim waiting for the blow to fall. He was the architect of the counterstrike. He looked at his mother, sitting straight-backed in her new chair, repeating the code word under her breath like a mantra. He would not fail her again. We'll be close, Sarah assured him before she and Mike left. We're not leaving this to chance. The moment a silent alarm trips, we'll be minutes away. We just need her to take the bait. Across town, in the sparse rented loft, the bait was being examined. Thomas stood over a large, hand-drawn map of David's property, which was spread across the cheap table. His thick, calloused finger traced the perimeter. The security is tight, Rebecca murmured from her laptop, her screen a cascade of data streams. But it's not perfect. I've been analyzing the light patterns for a week. The southeast corner, the old ladies' room, the sensors are lazy. There's a gap in the coverage between 11:03 p.m. and 11:07 p.m. every night. It's a 4-minute window. A system glitch, probably from a faulty alignment. It's our way in. Vanessa leaned over the map, a predator's smile gracing her lips. A glitch? Or is he getting sloppy? He thinks he's safe. He's gotten comfortable. Her eyes gleamed with triumph. He's made a mistake. Thomas grunted, his gray eyes fixed on the sketched outline of the mansion. He didn't believe in luck or mistakes. He believed in patterns and vulnerabilities. This looked like a vulnerability. He tapped the spot on the map, representing Margaret's bedroom window. This is the point of entry. 4 minutes. In and out. He didn't see the hidden camera lens, a silent, unblinking eye watching the very spot he was pointing to. Nor did he know that the room he planned to breach was an empty stage, set for a performance that would end with his arrest. The trap was set, the players were in position, and the only thing left to do was wait for the curtain to rise on the final dangerous act. The next 2 days were an exercise in suspended animation. The grand house functioned, but its heart beat in the quiet, darkened study where David watched the monitor feeds. The decoy bedroom remained a still life of implied occupancy, a lamp clicking on and off at prescribed hours, the shadowy silhouette in the wingback chair that was, in reality, a clever arrangement of pillows and a shawl. Margaret, in her fortified room, was a model of quiet courage, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythmic counterpoint to the silent digital vigil. The word bluebird was a shield she held close. David slept in fits and starts on the leather couch in his study, his phone clutched in his hand, the volume on the silent alarm system turned to its maximum. He communicated with Sarah Evans only through encrypted texts, their messages brief and functional. All quiet, no movement, sensors active. The waiting was a form of torture. Each creak of the old house's timbers a potential footstep. Each rustle of the wind in the oaks, a whisper of approaching menace. On the third night, the air grew heavy, the promise of a summer storm pressing down on the Kentucky landscape. Lightning flickered silently on the horizon, casting the monitored yard in brief, stark relief. It was 10:58 p.m. David was pouring himself a third cup of cold coffee when a soft, electronic chirp from the control panel froze him mid-pour. His eyes snapped to the monitor. The screen for camera 1, trained on the false blind spot, showed nothing but the dark, shifting shapes of the rhododendron bushes. But the log on the panel was clear. Southeast perimeter motion sensor triggered. His heart hammered against his ribs. A deer? The wind? He sent a one-word text to Sarah. Movement. Her reply was instantaneous. Acknowledged. Holding position. He stared at the screen, his breath held. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then a figure, dark and fluid, detached itself from the deeper shadows of the tree line. It was a man, large and broad-shouldered, moving with a predator's economy. Thomas. He paused at the edge of the manufactured darkness, his head tilted as if listening, then slipped into the shadowy path with the ease of a man stepping into his own home. He was exploiting the flaw Rebecca had so carefully identified. David's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his desk. He watched, his blood running cold, as Thomas reached Margaret's decoy window. There was a faint, almost inaudible scraping sound picked up by the camera's sensitive microphone, the sound of a window jimmy being inserted. The silent alarm on the window itself triggered next, another soft chirp from the panel. This was it. David's thumb hovered over the speed dial for Sarah, but he didn't press it. The plan was to catch them inside, to make the charge of home invasion and attempted kidnapping unassailable. He had to wait. He watched in horrified fascination as Thomas, with brutal efficiency, slid the window open and, after a quick scan of the empty room, hauled his bulk over the sill and disappeared inside. Camera 2, hidden in the hallway, now became the main event. David watched the screen as Thomas emerged from the bedroom, his gray eyes scanning the corridor. He moved with purpose toward the wingback chair, his intent clear. He was going to grab the occupant and be out within his 4-minute window. In the northwest guest room, Margaret heard the faint, muffled thud of a footfall in the hallway outside her old room. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her fingers, tangled in her yarn, stilled. She looked at the door, bolted from the inside, and then at the small black panic button lying on the bedside table. She did not press it. Not yet. The plan was to let the trap spring fully. Down the hall, Thomas reached the chair. His hand clamped down on the shoulder of the silhouette, and the moment he felt the yielding softness of pillows, he knew. A low, guttural curse escaped his lips. It was a setup. That was the signal. From his study, David saw the realization dawn on Thomas's face on the monitor. He pressed the call button. Now, Sarah, now! He didn't wait for a reply. Snatching the heavy metal flashlight he kept by the desk, he threw open his study door and ran into the hallway. Mother, stay in your room. Bolt the door, he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Thomas, his cover blown, abandoned all stealth. His objective shifted from kidnapping to escape. He turned from the decoy room and barreled down the hallway, straight toward the sound of David's voice. He was a bull and David was a flimsy gate. They met at the T-junction of the main hall. Thomas didn't break stride, lowering his shoulder to plow through the smaller man. But David, fueled by a lifetime of guilt and a ferocious, protective love, stood his ground. He swung the heavy flashlight not at Thomas's head, but at his leading knee. The connection was sickening, a crack of metal on bone and a roar of pain from Thomas. The big man stumbled, his charge broken, crashing into a small table and sending a vase shattering to the floor. Before Thomas could recover, the world exploded with light and sound. The front door burst open, splintering its frame. Detective Mike Miller entered first, his service weapon held in a 2-handed grip, his voice a thunderous command. Police on the ground! On the ground now! From the other end of the hall, Sarah Evans advanced, her own weapon trained on the downed assailant. Don't move, Thomas! It's over! Thomas, clutching his leg, snarled but had the sense to freeze. Mike was on him in seconds, wrenching his arms behind his back and slapping on handcuffs with practiced efficiency. David, his chest heaving, leaned against the wall, the flashlight dangling from his trembling hand. The immediate threat was neutralized. It was over. But Sarah's radio crackled to life. Unit 7 to Evans. We have the female suspect, Rebecca, in a vehicle down the road. She was running the comms. We're bringing her in. Mike looked up from securing Thomas. That's 2. Where's the ringleader? The question hung in the air, chilling despite the warmth of the night. David's eyes met Sarah's, and in that shared glance, a new, more profound dread took root. The foot soldiers had been captured, but the general was still in the field. The trap had snapped shut, but it had only caught 2 of the 3 rats. Vanessa, the architect of all their misery, was still out there, her rage now multiplied by failure, her next move in terrifying and unpredictable void. The house was secure, the immediate battle won, but the war for their future had just entered a more dangerous and shadowy phase. The capture of Thomas and Rebecca was a tactical victory, but the silence surrounding Vanessa's whereabouts was a poison that seeped into the walls of the house. For days, David and Margaret lived with a police escort, the unmarked car a constant grim reminder that the threat was not extinguished, only driven underground. Then the call came. Vanessa had been apprehended at a private airfield in Bowling Green, attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands using a forged passport. The case, meticulously built by Detective Evans, was now a solid, formidable thing. The district attorney, a stern woman named Patricia Walsh with a reputation for being relentless in cases involving the vulnerable, took personal charge. The justice they had sought now moved into the cold, formal arena of the Fayette County Courthouse. The air inside was a mix of old wood, floor polish, and a low, humming tension. Margaret, dressed in a simple navy blue dress, felt small and fragile on the hard wooden bench of the spectator gallery. David sat beside her, his posture rigid, a bulwark against the world. His hand covered hers, a warm, steady anchor. The proceedings were a surreal, nightmarish pageant. One by one, Thomas, Rebecca, and finally Vanessa were led in, shackled and dressed in county-issue jumpsuits. Thomas's face was a stony mask of resentment. Rebecca looked pale and calculating, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a legal loophole in the very air. But it was Vanessa who commanded the room's attention. Her beauty was undimmed by the drab clothing, but it was now a cold, sharp weapon. Her eyes, when they briefly met David's, held not a flicker of remorse, only a deep, glacial hatred. The charges were read aloud by the clerk, each one a hammer blow: conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, burglary in the first degree, criminal abuse of an adult, harassment. The evidence was laid out with methodical precision. Sarah Evans took the stand, her testimony clear and unshakable. She described the investigation, the discovery of the note, the forensic link to Vanessa, the digital footprint left by Rebecca that placed them all at the scene. She detailed the trap, the silent alarms, the video footage of Thomas entering the home. Then it was David's turn. He walked to the stand, his lawyer's composure firmly in place, but his voice trembled with a raw, barely controlled emotion when he spoke of finding his mother, of the note, of the psychological terror she had endured. He was not just a witness. He was an accuser, his every word a testament to a profound betrayal. Finally, the judge, an elderly man with a weary but perceptive gaze, allowed a victim impact statement. Margaret's legs could barely hold her as she was helped to the small podium. She did not look at the defendants. She looked at the judge, her voice a thin, reedy thread that nonetheless carried to every corner of the silent room. "Your Honor," she began, her hands gripping the wooden lectern, "I am 76 years old. I have buried my husband, I have raised my son, and I have always tried to live a good, quiet life. I never thought my final years would be filled with such fear." A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. To be made to feel like a burden in your own family's home, to be threatened and made to feel small and worthless, it steals a part of your soul, the sound of that glass breaking. I still hear it, but it's not the sound of the glass I hear most. It's the sound of the words that came after. They broke something much more precious inside me. She paused, gathering a strength David hadn't seen in months. I don't speak of this for vengeance. I speak for my dignity. I am not a burden. I am a person, and all I want now is to feel safe in my own home again, to sit in my garden with my son, and to forget the sound of those cruel, cruel words. Her statement hung in the air, a simple, devastating indictment of the calculated cruelty she had suffered. It was more powerful than any legal argument. Even the court reporter had paused to wipe her eye. The pleas came next. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Thomas and Rebecca, through their public defenders, entered guilty pleas in exchange for lengthy, though reduced, sentences. They were led away, their fates sealed. Then it was Vanessa's turn. Her high-priced attorney argued for leniency, painting a picture of a woman driven by the stress of a failing marriage and the pressures of caring for an elderly relative. He spoke of her charitable work, her standing in the community. It was a performance of breathtaking hypocrisy. The judge was unmoved. He looked down at Vanessa, his expression one of profound distaste. "Ms. Henderson," he began, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. "The evidence presented here today depicts not a moment of stress, but a campaign of psychological terror, escalating to a meticulously planned criminal conspiracy. You exploited a position of trust to abuse a vulnerable elder, and when that was no longer enough, you conspired to have her kidnapped for financial gain. The court finds your actions to be among the most callous and premeditated it has seen." He sentenced her to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of early parole. The gavel fell with a definitive crack. It was over. David felt a massive weight lift from his shoulders, a physical sensation of release. He wrapped his arm around his mother, pulling her close as she wept softly against his shoulder. They were free. Weeks turned into months. The mansion slowly began to feel like a home again. The security system remained, but it was no longer a central character in their lives. Margaret's laughter returned, often prompted by visits from Dorothy, who became a permanent fixture in their lives. David found a new balance, scaling back his hours at the firm, his priorities forever shifted. They planted a new rose bush in the garden, a vibrant yellow one, a symbol of their hard-won peace. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance over the lawn, Margaret looked at her son, her expression serene. "I feel safe, David, truly safe. Thank you." He squeezed her hand, a profound contentment settling in his heart. They had faced the storm and emerged, scarred but unbroken. Justice had been served. The nightmare was finally truly over. Yet as the last light of day faded, a plain, unmarked envelope was delivered by a bicycle courier. It was addressed to David. Puzzled, he opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a single glossy photograph. It was a recent picture of him and his mother, taken from a distance as they worked in their garden just 2 days prior. On the back, in a familiar, elegant script that sent a jolt of ice through his veins, were 4 words. "Prisons have visiting hours." The gavel's crack was not an end, but a period placed in the middle of a sentence. In the echoing quiet of the Fayette County Courthouse, David felt the seismic shift. The weight of the immediate threat, the prowling, the planning, the palpable danger, had been lifted by the judge's stern pronouncement. Vanessa, Thomas, and Rebecca were remanded into custody, their futures now measured in the stark, gray increments of a state penitentiary. The justice they had sought was delivered, cold and hard and final. Outside, the Kentucky sun felt different on their skin, cleaner, warmer. Margaret held his arm, her grip firm, her posture no longer that of a haunted victim, but of a survivor. Reporters swarmed, their shouted questions a buzzing nuisance, but David kept walking, shielding his mother, his focus on the open door of the waiting car. "It's over, Mother," he whispered, the words a vow. "It's truly over." The mansion, once a gilded cage of fear, slowly began to breathe again. The silent alarms were disarmed, the motion sensors realigned to their original, non-deceptive positions. The decoy bedroom was restored, the pillows and shawl put away. David returned to his firm, but his priorities were irrevocably altered. He left at 5, he declined weekend work, and his world contracted to the peaceful radius of his mother's garden. They planted new roses, their vibrant colors a deliberate defiance of the memory of that sterile, sunlit kitchen. Evenings were spent on the porch with Dorothy, the 3 of them sharing sweet tea and easy laughter, the sound a healing balm on the house's wounded spirit. Margaret's transformation was the most profound. The constant, nervous tremor in her hands subsided. The apologies for minor clumsiness ceased. She spoke of the past not with flinching shame, but with a quiet, dignified sorrow. The line on her thumb faded to a nearly invisible silver thread. She had reclaimed her narrative, and in doing so, had reclaimed herself. Weeks bled into months, and the sharp edges of the trauma softened, blurred by the gentle monotony of a peaceful life. David allowed himself to believe in the finality of it all. The legal updates became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Vanessa's name was never spoken. She became a ghost, an unpleasant memory safely locked away behind concrete and steel. It was on a Tuesday, an utterly ordinary day, that the envelope arrived. It was mixed in with the usual stack of legal journals and charitable solicitations, a plain manila rectangle with no return address. The postmark was local. Puzzled, David slid it open at his study desk. Inside was not a letter, but a single glossy photograph. It was a picture of him and his mother, taken from a distance, likely with a long lens. They were in the garden 2 days prior, Margaret laughing as she pointed to a blooming hydrangea, David smiling down at her with a fondness that had become his new default state. The intimacy of the moment, captured without their knowledge, was a violation that stole the air from his lungs. His hands began to tremble. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in a familiar, elegant script, a script he had seen on holiday cards and dinner party invitations, a script that was now a brand of pure evil, were 4 words. Prisons have visiting hours. The floor seemed to drop away beneath him. The carefully reconstructed piece of the last few months shattered into a million glittering, terrifying shards. It wasn't a threat of immediate violence. It was something far more insidious. It was a reminder that walls could not contain hatred, that sentences had ends, and that Vanessa's influence, her network, her relentless, venomous will had not been imprisoned with her. She was reaching out from her cell, her finger touching their lives once more, proving that their safety was, and might always be, an illusion. The battle in the courtroom was won, but the sentence she was serving was not a conclusion. It was merely an intermission, and she was already writing the script for the next, terrifying act. The photograph was a stone dropped into the still pond of their new life, the ripples spreading out in silent, concentric rings of dread. David stared at the 4 words until the elegant script seemed to writhe on the page. He didn't tell his mother. He locked the photo in his safe, a new cold weight settling in his gut alongside the old fears. The victory in the courtroom felt hollow, a temporary ceasefire in a war he now feared was eternal. But he refused to let Vanessa's ghost win. If she was watching, he would give her a show of unwavering normalcy, of a life not just endured, but lived fully. He became more deliberate, more present. His dedication to his mother became his armor. He cleared his calendar for her weekly medical checkups, sitting patiently in waiting rooms, his presence a quiet bulwark against the world. He drove her to physical therapy for her arthritis, cheering her small victories as her grip strengthened, the same hands Vanessa had called useless now, confidently squeezing a therapeutic putty. Most importantly, he never missed her Thursday afternoon sessions with Dr. Irene Albright, a gentle-vowed psychologist with kind eyes and an office that smelled of lavender. He would wait in the adjoining cafe, sipping bitter coffee and watching the door, a sentry guarding her path to healing. Inside the calm, book-lined office, Margaret's journey was slower, more internal. For weeks, she had spoken in halting sentences about the wall, the note, the feeling of being a burden. Dr. Albright listened, her questions soft but persistent, gently untangling the knots of shame and fear Vanessa had tied so tightly. One sunny Thursday, as dappled light played across the rug, Dr. Albright placed a blank note card and a pen in front of Margaret. "Today, I don't want you to talk about the fear," she said. "I want you to write down what's on the other side of it." Margaret's gnarled fingers picked up the pen. She sat for a long moment, her gaze turned inward, traveling back through the dark corridors of the last year. David's face, etched with worry and love, appeared in her mind. The feel of the warm sun on her back in her garden. The sound of Dorothy's laughter. The steady, consistent rhythm of her son's care. She thought of the photograph David had tried to hide, the one she'd found him staring at with a haunted look. He thought he was protecting her, but she knew. And knowing, she had made a choice. She bent over the card, her handwriting slow but sure. She wrote a single powerful sentence. When she finished, she slid the card across the table to Dr. Albright. The psychologist read it, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. The card said, "I am not afraid anymore." It wasn't a declaration of being cured or of forgetting. It was a statement of choice. She had chosen to inhabit the safety David had fought so hard to build. She had chosen to trust in the love that surrounded her. She had chosen to stop letting Vanessa's shadow dim her sun. Dr. Albright met David in the cafe afterward, her expression warm. "She's made a breakthrough today, David. A significant one." She didn't reveal the confidence, but her tone was filled with a professional certainty that felt like a solid ground beneath his feet. On the drive home, Margaret was quiet, but a new serenity seemed to emanate from her. She placed her hand over his on the gear shift. "Thank you, David, for everything." He looked at her, truly looked, and saw the change. The constant shadow of anxiety in her eyes had receded, replaced by a quiet light. The rigid, fearful posture had softened. The therapy, the consistency, the unwavering support, it was working. They were not just surviving, they were healing, their bond reforged in the fire of their shared ordeal, stronger and more precious than ever. That evening, as David sorted through the day's mail, a different kind of letter caught his eye. It was from the Kentucky State Parole Board. His breath hitched. It was far too early for any consideration of parole for Vanessa. Frowning, he tore it open. It was a notification, dry and bureaucratic. Inmate Vanessa Henderson, it stated, had filed a formal appeal against her conviction, citing prosecutorial misconduct and ineffective assistance of counsel. The process was lengthy, the letter explained, but a preliminary hearing had been scheduled to review the merits of her claims. The paper crinkled in his tightening grip. This was her next move. This was the legal, insidious way she was using those visiting hours. She wasn't just sending threats from the shadows. She was fighting to get out. The peace he had fought for, the safety his mother had just claimed for herself, was once again being challenged not by a prowler in the night, but by a name on a legal document. The battle was moving to a new arena, and the stakes were, impossibly, even higher. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon had become the signature aroma of their mornings. A far cry from the sterile silence that once haunted the Kentucky mansion. 3 years. The number felt both monumental and mundane, woven into the very fabric of their new life. David stood at the stove, a striped apron tied over his work shirt, expertly flipping blueberry pancakes. The morning sun streamed through the large kitchen window, illuminating the vibrant herb garden Margaret tended on the sill. The house itself seemed to have exhaled, its grand rooms now filled with warmth instead of echoes. A well-loved quilt was draped over the back of the sofa. A stack of library books sat on the coffee table. Photographs of their small, reclaimed joys, trips to the Red River Gorge, dinners with Dorothy, a birthday party in the garden, lined the mantelpiece. It was no longer a showpiece. It was a home, its soul restored. Margaret walked in, not with the hesitant shuffle of old, but with a steady, purposeful gait. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a soft blue cardigan, a gift from David for her 79th birthday. She didn't flinch at the clatter of a pan or offer a reflexive apology. She simply smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Smells wonderful in here, David. You'll spoil me." "That's the plan, Mother," he said, his own smile easy and unforced. He slid a golden brown pancake onto her plate. "The blueberries are from the farmer's market. Dorothy said they're the sweetest of the season." This was their rhythm now. His legal career was still successful, but it no longer owned him. He'd built firm boundaries, delegating more, leaving by 5 to be home for this, for her. Her therapy had given her tools, but it was this daily, consistent care that had built the foundation of her healing. They talked about her garden, the book she was reading, the card game she'd had with Dorothy the night before. The past was acknowledged, but not given power. It was a chapter they had closed, its lessons absorbed, but its pain no longer dictating their present. As they ate, David watched her. He saw the woman who had faced down her demons and chosen peace. The ghost of Vanessa's threat, the chilling photograph and the parole board appeals, had not vanished, but they had been relegated to a managed perimeter. A better security system, a continued quiet relationship with Detective Evans, and a fierce shared resolve had built a fortress not of fear, but of love. Vanessa's last, desperate appeal had been denied 6 months ago, a finality that had felt like a real exhale. "I was thinking," Margaret said, dabbing her mouth with a napkin, "after my physical therapy today, I might try that new recipe for lemon lavender scones. Dorothy is coming over for tea tomorrow." "That sounds perfect," David replied, his heart full. This was the life he had fought for, this simple, beautiful normality. After breakfast, he cleared the plates while she went to get ready for her appointment. As he loaded the dishwasher, his phone, lying on the counter, buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, expecting it to be his secretary or perhaps Dorothy. Instead, the name that flashed up sent an unexpected, cold jolt through his system, a relic from a past he thought was firmly buried. It was the direct line for the warden at the Women's State Penitentiary, where Vanessa was serving her 15-year sentence. His thumb hovered over the screen, the cheerful clatter of the kitchen suddenly feeling distant. A call from the warden wasn't routine. It wasn't about an appeal or a legal maneuver. It was something else, something operational. His lawyer's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had something happened to her? An illness? An incident? He didn't answer. He let it go to voicemail, the cheerful morning light suddenly feeling thin and fragile. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain a closed chapter. It was calling, and the sound of its ring was a cold stone dropped into the warm, still waters of their hard-won peace. The cheerful morning light in the kitchen felt different after the warden's call. David listened to the voicemail twice, his body rigid. It wasn't about Vanessa directly, but about Thomas. He was up for his first parole hearing. The warden, as a courtesy due to the high-profile nature of the case, was informing the victims. They had the right to attend, to make a statement. David stood at the sink, watching his mother in the garden. She was carefully tying a tomato plant to a stake, her movements slow but sure. For 3 days, he carried the knowledge like a stone in his pocket. He watched her laugh with Dorothy over tea, saw the quiet concentration on her face as she worked on her latest project. An intricate embroidery hoop. He knew what he had to do. He would not let this new threat, this echo from the past, dim the light she had worked so hard to reclaim. He finally told her over a quiet dinner, his voice calm and measured. "Mother, there's something I need to do. Thomas has a parole hearing. I've decided to go." Margaret's fork stilled above her plate. She looked at him not with fear, but with a deep, weary sadness. "Do you think it's necessary, David? To go back into that world? I think it's necessary for me," he said, reaching for her hand. "I need to look him in the eye, not as the terrified son I was that night, but as the man I am now. I need to speak for the family he tried to break. I need to close some doors so we can finally, truly, open others." He looked toward the living room, where her embroidery sat on a side table. "And our home will keep a light on. It always will." Margaret was silent for a long moment, then gave a slow, decisive nod. "Then we will both have our work to do while you're gone." The day before his trip, the local community center was buzzing with the gentle hum of the annual craft fair. Banners fluttered, and tables groaned under the weight of quilts, pottery, and preserves. David had been hesitant, but Margaret had insisted. "It's part of the new door, David," she'd said. And so he stood with Dorothy and a small crowd of neighbors before a modest display. In the center, mounted and framed under glass, was Margaret's embroidery. It was a stunning, deeply moving piece titled "The Door with the Light On." She had stitched a beautiful, sturdy wooden door, slightly ajar. From within, a warm, golden light spilled out, illuminating the dark, textured threads of a night sky. The detail was exquisite. The grain of the wood, the glint of a brass knob, the almost tangible warmth of that emanating light. It wasn't a picture of a house, but of a heart, of a sanctuary, of their home. Dorothy, her arm linked through Margaret's, beamed with pride. "I told you, Margaret Henderson. I told you they'd see it." People stopped, their chatter softening as they took in the piece. They didn't know the full story, but they felt its truth. They saw the resilience, the hope, the defiant warmth in the face of darkness. An older man, a retired woodworker from down the lane, blinked rapidly and squeezed David's shoulder. "Your mother has a gift, son. That's something special." David looked at his mother, standing tall amidst her community, no longer a victim, but an artist, a creator. She had taken the threads of her pain and woven them into a testament of their survival. This was her statement. This was her answer. The next morning, David kissed his mother goodbye, her frame held tightly against him. "The light will be on," she whispered. The drive to the state penitentiary was a journey through a landscape of his own memories. He parked in a lot surrounded by coiled razor wire, the institutional gray of the building, a stark contrast to the vibrant warmth of the craft fair. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of bleach and stale anxiety. He was ushered into a small, windowless room where the parole board sat at a long table, and there, in an ill-fitting jumpsuit, sat Thomas. 3 years had carved more lines into his face, but his gray eyes were the same, flat, emotionless. He showed no reaction to David's presence. When it was his turn to speak, David stood. He didn't have notes. He spoke from the memory of the flashlight cracking against a knee, from the image of his mother facing a wall, from the sight of her embroidery glowing under community center lights. "I'm not here to ask for vengeance," David began, his voice clear and steady in the sterile room. "I'm here to speak about a light. The man sitting here, Thomas, along with others, tried with calculated cruelty to extinguish that light. They terrorized an elderly woman, violated our home, and sought to destroy our family's soul. They failed." He looked directly at Thomas. "My mother is 79 years old. She is not broken. She is an artist whose work was just featured in her community. She gardens. She laughs with her friends. The home you tried to desecrate is filled with more love and light than it ever was before." He turned back to the board. "Rehabilitation requires remorse. I see none. Releasing this man would not protect society. It would simply reintroduce a dangerous instrument back into the hands of those who might use him. The light in our home is on, but the door to his freedom, in my opinion, should remain firmly closed." He sat down. The hearing concluded with formalities. As he was led out, David allowed himself one last look at Thomas. The man's stony mask was intact, but David saw something new, not remorse, but a flicker of frustrated confusion. He could not comprehend this language of light and resilience. He only understood force and fear. David walked out of the prison, the heavy door buzzing shut behind him. He stood in the parking lot, drawing deep, clean breaths of the free air. He had closed a door. He felt a certainty, a finality that the legal sentencing had never provided. He had faced the past on his own terms and had spoken not from a place of fear, but from a place of strength. He called his mother as soon as he was on the road. "It's done," he said, the weight lifting from his voice. "I'm coming home." Her voice was warm with relief. "We'll be waiting, dear." "Dorothy is here. We're making your favorite pot roast." That evening, as the three of them sat around the dining table, the house felt more secure than ever. The conversation was light, filled with plans for the garden and talk of the craft fair's success. Margaret's embroidery now had a prominent place on the living room wall, a daily reminder of their journey. Later, as David was turning off the lights, his phone vibrated on the counter. It was an email from a blocked sender. Frowning, he opened it. There was no text, only a hyperlink. A cold dread, so familiar yet so unwelcome, prickled at the back of his neck. He hovered his thumb over the link, a part of him screaming to delete it, to preserve the peace of the evening. But the lawyer in him, the protector, had to know. He clicked it. The link took him to a stark, anonymous blog. The header was a single stark word, reckoning. And the first and only post was a scanned image of a document. It was a handwritten letter, the script elegant and unmistakable. It was Vanessa's handwriting. The date at the top was from just 1 week ago. The salutation made his blood run cold. "My dearest readers," it began, "they think walls can contain a story. They are wrong. Let me tell you what really happened in that Kentucky mansion. Let me tell you about the son, the saint, and the secrets he keeps." The blog post was a ghost, a digital poison seeping through the cracks of their carefully rebuilt walls. David stood frozen in the dark kitchen, the phone's glow illuminating the stark panic on his face. She was writing. From her cell, Vanessa was crafting a new weapon, a narrative designed to twist their truth into something ugly and vindictive. He wanted to smash the phone, to delete the link and pretend he'd never seen it, but he couldn't. This was a new front in the war, and ignorance was a luxury he could no longer afford. He didn't tell his mother, not that night, as the comforting aroma of pot roast still lingered in the air, and not the next morning, when she hummed softly while watering her herbs. He carried the secret like a shard of ice in his chest, its cold dread a counterpoint to the warmth of the sunlit kitchen. He forwarded the link to Sarah Evans with a terse message. She started a blog. Need to know if this violates any conditions. Sarah's reply was swift and grim. It's protected speech, David. As long as she doesn't make direct threats or reveal confidential information, there's little we can do. But we're monitoring it. Stay vigilant. Vigilance, however, was a state of being that Margaret seemed to be consciously moving beyond. A few days later, David found her in the living room, carefully folding a delicate, lace-trimmed crocheted shawl. It was a beautiful, intricate piece of work, the color of cream and sage green, one she had worked on for months. "That's Miriam," David said, recognizing the shawl he'd watched her create stitch by stitch. "It is," Margaret said, her voice soft. She ran a hand over the soft yarn. "It kept my hands busy. It kept my mind from darker places." She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "But it's finished now, and I don't think it was ever really for me." She had heard from Dorothy about a woman named Claire, a recent widow who had moved into a small apartment complex on the other side of Lexington. Claire was struggling, Dorothy said, her world shrunk by grief and the daunting silence of an empty home. "Dorothy is taking me to see her this afternoon," Margaret announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Miriam needs a new home. I think Claire might need her more than I do." David felt a lump form in his throat. This simple, profound act of passing on comfort was his mother's true victory. It was her declaration that their story was not one of perpetual defense, but of proactive kindness. While Vanessa spun lies in the digital shadows, Margaret was weaving a different kind of web, one of empathy and connection. Later that week, David had his own act of declaration to make. He stood beside Sarah Evans in a different courtroom, this one for a sentencing hearing for a different case. A young man named Kyle, convicted of a brutal assault. Sarah had asked David to speak as a character witness for the victim's family. But his statement had evolved into something more. "Your Honor," David began, his voice resonating in the quiet room, "I stand here today not just as a lawyer, but as a man who has seen the devastating aftermath of violence and cruelty up close. My own family was targeted, my mother terrorized in what should have been the safest place in the world for her." He paused, letting the weight of his past settle in the room. "For a long time, I believed justice was only about punishment, about building walls to keep the bad things out. I was wrong." He glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "True justice is also about reconstruction. It's about the patient, often painful work of rebuilding a family's spirit. It's about the small, daily acts of care that restore a sense of safety. It's about a mother finding the courage to pass a handmade shawl to another woman in pain. The man who hurt this family deserves his punishment, yes, but I urge the court to also consider the long, difficult road of reconstruction that lies ahead for these victims. Their sentence does not end today. Their work is just beginning." His words were a world away from the legalistic arguments he'd once built his career on. They were human, raw, and spoke to a truth every person in the courtroom understood on some level. The judge listened, his expression thoughtful. That evening, David returned home, the emotional fatigue of the day clinging to him. The house was quiet. He found his mother in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair, a new skein of lavender yarn in her lap. Her embroidery, the door with the light on, glowed softly on the wall opposite her. "Claire loved the shawl," Margaret said softly, not looking up from her work. She cried. Then she smiled, a real smile. David knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "What you did was brave, Mother. More brave than you know." "It was necessary," she corrected gently. "We cannot live our lives always looking over our shoulders, David. We have to keep looking forward. We have to keep passing the light along." As night fell, they moved to the porch, sitting in the comfortable silence that had become their sanctuary. The sky was a deep velvety blue, the first stars pricking through the dusk. David reached over and flipped the switch for the large wrought iron porch light. It bloomed into a warm, golden halo, pushing back the darkness, illuminating the familiar shapes of the rocking chairs and the pots of blooming geraniums. It was no longer just a light. It was a beacon, a promise, a direct, unspoken rebuttal to the digital venom spewing from a prison cell and the cold finality of a parole hearing. It was the light in Margaret's embroidery made manifest. It was the light his father had kept on for him, the light he now kept for his mother. It was a declaration that this home, this family, would not be defined by the shadows cast upon it, but by the light it chose to generate night after night after night. Inside, on the kitchen counter, David's phone screen lit up with a new notification. It was an automated alert he'd set up after discovering the blog. The subject line was from Reckoning. The preview text read, and the so-called saint had secrets of his own. Secrets that began long before I entered the picture, in a little blue house on Elm Street. The blue house on Elm Street was not a secret, but a sanctuary. It was the house where David had grown up, where his father had taught him to whittle, and where his mother had sung old folk songs while hanging laundry on the line. Vanessa's attempt to weaponize that memory was her most profound miscalculation. Instead of sparking fear, it ignited a final decisive resolve in David. He would not just defend their story, he would reclaim it, stitch by stitch. He found his mother in the living room, the lavender yarn for her new project resting in her lap. He sat beside her and told her everything, about the blog, about the secret of the blue house. Margaret listened, her expression not one of fear, but of a deep, weary sadness that slowly hardened into resolve. "She wants to live in the past," Margaret said, her voice firm. "We do not. That blue house holds our joy. We will not let her steal it." It was her idea, the blanket. Not just any blanket, but a freedom quilt, she called it. In a small, old-fashioned fabric store in downtown Lexington, they chose the cloth together. It was a thick, soft wool in a deep, resilient blue, the color of a twilight sky just after the sun has set. "For protection," the elderly shopkeeper had said, her fingers brushing the bolt. "Blue like this, it's for safety and peace. A good choice." For weeks, the blue fabric became the center of their home. David would read legal briefs on the sofa, while Margaret, her hands steadier than they'd been in years, worked with a large, sharp needle and thick thread. She didn't crochet or knit this time. She quilted, creating large, simple, sturdy stitches that bound layers of the blue wool to a soft, fleece backing. It was a physical, tangible act of creation, a bulwark being woven against the intangible, digital poison. They talked as she worked, about his father, about the old oak tree in the backyard of the blue house, about good memories that no blog post could ever tarnish. The night she put in the final stitch, a sense of ceremony filled the air. As dusk fell, David did not just turn on the porch light. He moved through the entire mansion, room by room, flipping every switch. The kitchen, the living room, the hallways, the upstairs bedrooms, all blazed with light, a defiant, brilliant constellation against the Kentucky night. The house was not hiding. It was proclaiming its presence, its vitality, its unbroken spirit. They wrapped themselves in the new blue blanket, sitting together on the porch swing. Its weight was comforting, a shared armor. In Margaret's lap was a simple leather-bound journal, a gift from David. On its first page, in her careful, looping script, she began to write. "Courage," she wrote, "is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to build a quilt on a quiet evening, to fill a house with light, to write down your truth in a book. It is the choice to be kind when you have been shown cruelty, to find peace when you are surrounded by echoes of chaos. Our story is not one of victimhood, but of victory. The cruel have been punished, their influence shrinking to the faint, desperate clicks of a keyboard in a lonely cell. And we, the good, have been rewarded with this, a quiet night, a warm blanket, and the unwavering certainty of our love. This is our justice. This is our peace." David read the words over her shoulder, his eyes glistening. He took the pen and added a single line below. "And we will never let the lights go out again." It felt like a true ending, a perfect, peaceful closure. The war was over. Love and justice had indeed prevailed. Later, as David prepared for bed, the house still glowing around him, his phone chimed with a calendar notification he'd forgotten he'd set months ago. It wasn't an alarm for a meeting or a court date. It was a simple, automated reminder he'd created in a moment of grim determination. The notification read, Parole Eligibility Review, VH, 6 months. He stared at the screen, the peaceful warmth of the evening suddenly cooling around him. It was just a procedural date, a formality in the long, slow grind of the justice system. Vanessa's appeals had failed. Her blog was the ranting of a powerless woman. The light, the quilt, the journal, they were real. This was just a date on a screen. He dismissed the notification and climbed into bed, pulling the blue blanket up to his chin. The house was quiet, safe, and bright. But as he closed his eyes, the ghost of that date seemed to hang in the air, a tiny, dark punctuation mark at the very end of their happy ending, a silent question mark hovering in the well-lit silence.